We just saw how we can put the information of the bindings up on the screen. Now that we know the error, we can fix it in our HTML. And then let's go ahead and make this a little bit cleaner. So we know that first is not the name. We'll make it first name. And there's the information there. But what if we wanted to reuse this binding? Having one called binding info is not totally accurate because that's really showing us the binding for the people array. And we've actually had to write a couple lines of code to make this work. What if we had a generic binding handler that we could just apply in our HTML to say, go ahead and display any information about the bindings on this page? For example, instead of saying data bind text equal to binding info, what if we had a binding handler called, let's say, dump, because we're going to dump the data out, and then we bind it to whatever we want to, like people. Now this doesn't exist yet, so nothing's working here, but let's go ahead and write this up. First, we have to go over and create a new file in the plunker. So on the left-hand side, we'll create this new file, and let's call this our dump file. That's where we're going to stick our binding handler. And in Knockout, you can create new binding handlers just like you have for text or enable or click, just by going in and extending the binding handlers and then creating a new variable here called dump. So now we've got this new binding handler, and we have to tell it some information. And inside of a binding handler, you've got an init and an update function. The init function is all we're going to really need here. So when it runs the first time, we want it to go out and get information about the bindings. The first thing you're passed in that Knockout gives you is the element that you're bound to, and then you get the value accessor. That's the value that you're bound to. We can also get to the all bindings accessor. That's if there's any other bindings on that particular element. And then we get a view model, so whatever the page is bound to in this case. And then finally, there's something called the binding context. We'll be using several of these, and I'll turn off the live preview for now. And let's go ahead and wrap that function. And now we're going to say, let's create some variables in here. First, we want to grab the context. And the context is going to be the value of the value accessor. That's the thing that we're going to be bound to in this case. Specifically, if you go back to the index.html, that's going to be the people right there on line 13. So once we have that, the next thing I want to do is grab the value for all bindings. And notice that we're unwrapping these values. So context is going to be set to the value for value accessor, unwrapping it, because these are going to be observables, and then so will all bindings. Next, I want to create a pre-element. So I don't want to force the user to actually create the pre on the page. Instead, I'm just going to create it for them. I can use this here inside the browser. We'll create the element, and we'll call it pre here. And then we're going to append that element to the DOM. This way we can create a div, or we can create a span, or whatever we want on the page for the binding. And inside of there, we're going to stick this pre element. And we like to use a pre because it gives us natural spacing and look for the code. Now we need to create the computer that's going to put our JSON out there. So let's go ahead and create a computer called dump.json. Let's have a read value for our function. And for this one, we can just go back to script.js, and we can copy in the return statement. And instead of using people, this will be the context. We're going to do a little tidying up by passing in a parameter called dispose when node is removed. And this is just going to tidy up the computed whenever that element is removed. Now that we have our computed and we know where the element is and we've got our pre, let's go ahead and bind dump.json out to the text of that pre. And to that, we're going to use not apply bindings, but apply bindings to node. That's another Knockout function which allows us to pass in what is the thing we're going to bind to, and what are the values we're going to bind. So now we're going to pass in an object here, and all we're going to do is set a binding for text and set it to dump.json. We've got one missing semicolon. We'll add that in here. And now let's go out to the live preview and check out what our HTML looks like. We shouldn't see anything yet inside the gray because we haven't actually used this dump binding handler. So let's go back to our script first, and let's comment out our binding info. We don't need that anymore. In fact, we'll just delete it. We'll remove it from the return value of the viewmodel2. And back in the HTML, we now have to reference this new script file. So we should go to the bottom of the page, and we'll copy and paste this and put in dump.js. And then we press save, we should see our pre, which is actually inside of a pre. And the reason for that is because we bound it to a pre, but we can stick it inside of a regular div now. And what actually happens is that div gets created, and then inside of there, it sticks inside of pre. So if you right click to inspect element inside of Chrome, you're going to see inside the browser. Let's do that again. We've got inspect, and inside the browser, there's our pre inside of a div. So we've bound to dump people, and it created this pre, and then just put out all the JSON that we used. And the nice thing is we can create multiple of these. So let's say we didn't have something called people, instead we had something called people, and then inside of there we had first name, and actually we're going to need to go to the first element of people. So I don't recommend typing something like this, but it just shows you that what you can do is you can print out John down there, for example, if you want to see a specific value. So we can reuse this as often as we like.